That's not how public policy works.
No.
Like, we wait till the disaster, and then it gets bumped up in priority above other things, and then we start planning, and we're rushing around, trying to allocate money and trying to allocate policies, and I just don't know how we could convince the public to spend $10 billion on something like water ahead of scarcity or ahead of excess water, because we might have both, right, in Ontario. I just don't know how we would convince people that that was a wise move when there's tons of other priorities that need public dollars and public attention.
I don't have an answer because I never wash the windows unless I've got company coming. And I'm never careful with how much toothpaste I use until it's almost all gone. It's our human nature to react to the crash at the crossroads. That's when we put the stoplights up. I guess if we were really paying attention and looking at the early warning signals, and I do think we chase our tails a lot, and we're not very thoughtful. We're not very thoughtful about sitting back, and we don't take the time to think that. So that benefits work that I did on the Coorong, and I did an Indigenous project too, Indigenous Values to Water. Well, I started it before I left. Other people finished it, but. That came out of a group, a huge research organization called the Commonwealth Scientific and Industrial, CSIRO. And it's like a ginormous countrywide university with no teaching. So it used to have 6,000 employees. And so there was time to think. And there was the capacity, there were the people to think about what should we be thinking about. And so we were starting to do in our group, and I was asked to join the group, was my idea, how do we allocate water better? Because there is going to be a crash at the crossroads. So there were early warning signals, and they knew it was going to happen. And we talked for 6 months, and I said, you know what we're going to not know when this happens? We're not going to know the value of the environmental benefits of these trade-offs. So why don't we do some projects on that? And so we did, and there was money to do that. So I guess that's all we can do is to, centers of excellence, and pay attention to them, but maybe researchers are really bad at not doing relevant stuff. Or doing irrelevant stuff. Maybe that's what the right way to say it is. And so, you need people watching them, and you need local input. I don't know what the framework is. It's easy to look at it from now, looking backward, and say, what should we have done? And maybe that's what some people like Sharon and Brent, and they are doing it. They just maybe who's listening. I think I've been in a policy seat a lot of times in my life, and you tend to, and I'm not saying you guys are, but you're not always allowed to do what you think is right.
Never.
Well, you're not only busy, but also, there's an election coming, we can't talk about this right now. Or, if we talk about this, then they'll get mad, and we don't have money for them, so we better not deal with that. There's all those problems. So I don't have the answers. I'm still trying to deal with my toothpaste tube. But, people do. People know how to think through these things, and I think that's what we need to do. I don't think we can ignore it.
Yeah, I think things have gotten, I'm not quite as dire. Crises do happen, and it does make things, solutions happen faster. But what I've seen over the years is that people are thinking about what could potentially happen. It's really important for outside think tanks who have more time to, maybe, think broadly, that they do some of that thinking and bring that to the table. But if some of that thinking hasn't already been done, there's almost no solutions ready to go when the crisis happens. it would be physically impossible to work from like zero information to a solution within sometimes 6 months to, it's ridiculous sometimes how quickly you have to have it done. But there is work out there, and we're also learning a lot from other jurisdictions. We don't always have to reinvent the wheel. It was great to hear the Australian situation, right? Like, Ontario doesn't have to start from scratch if we have a situation like that.
We wrote that policy, that $10 billion policy in like 4 weeks. It happened really quickly, and that's what I meant by a policy window. And the way it was done is people were brought in, the top people in like water information and all of that. They were just sucked right into the Department of the Prime Minister and Cabinet, and we just worked nonstop. And I don't know, was I blessed or cursed to be in that room? I don't know, because it was really hard work, and I'm really glad we did that. And so, yes, it can get done, and the only reason I was able to come up with that buyback number is the Living Murray Initiative had done that early research. The institutions were set up. They were, we had robust separation, we had water trade, we had a market, and so, it was baby steps. It just there was a big leap at the end to get. So, yeah, the pieces were there, and people were thinking. The CSIRO is amazing, and the reason I talk about them is they're totally getting eroded. The reason I'm here is there's no research money in Australia.
I like it. Not sure if I should ask the questions, but I'm interested in the discussion around collaborative governance. Certainly I'm involved in it myself. And I heard some concerns about the increased pressure and time constraints of that process. And Brent, you mentioned the time and resources from within government in terms of the science and having time for the conversation. So I'm thinking what is government's role in building capacity for collaborative governance? Because it's something that Rob talked about in this morning's discussion, is that he thought that was really important for the agriculture sector in particular, is to build that capacity and remain at the table. So I think I see it only increasing, the demand for that collaborative governance. So what's our role to promote that beyond opening it up and saying we're going to collaborate? We have a role to build capacity in others, not just ourselves, not just the government.
I guess I'll start. I'll offer a couple of things. I think why there was some success in South Australia, and I haven't been as directly involved as probably some of you have been in the source protection planning process in Ontario. But in both of those cases, the collaboration was institutionalized, so it was built into legislation and regulation, so that it gave some legitimacy to it, so that even though there were differences among the committees that I looked at in terms of how efficiently they felt their time was being used and the extent to which they were being listened to, at least the outcomes of that process were going to result in sort of tangible policies and tangible outcomes. So I think that's a positive thing that government can do. Maybe you guys may have some other thoughts, and I'll come back to, there's other aspects of that. I appreciate your question about capacity and the capacity for people to participate in those processes. I realize that it's sometimes a financial issue. I think it gets to the point I mentioned earlier about making sure that you set up those processes so that they run in a meaningful way, and so that people feel like they're contributing in a meaningful way to them is important. I'll think about it a little bit more. Well, I don't know if you guys have anything you want to add to that.
Sure, I'll just give a couple of examples that indicate what a government can do to bring that kind of collaboration. So, I don't know if anyone here is familiar with the Lake Simcoe Protection Act and Plan, but government in that case established a piece of legislation and established a collaborative body which specified, the legislation specified who needed to be on that collaborative coordinating committee, I guess it's called. And it has an ongoing function and objectives and deliverables associated with that. So it set up the structure, made sure that the representation was valid for the watershed, and it gave a structure that allowed for longevity, because that's the other thing. You need to be able to do adaptive management, whether it's just related to water quantity or water quantity and water quality issues. You need to be able to have the right people around the table, but also have those supports in place to bring the right science, to make sure they're making progress, to adjust your plan as you're going in each case. So government has a big role in setting up those structures and seeing that they work consistently over time.
Can I add from the Australian experience? They, the biggest example is the Indigenous peoples in the Murray-Darling Basin, and this started back in the Murray-Darling Commission era. A big chunk, I don't know how much, of funding was allocated so that they could set up organizations that represented themselves, because they didn't have the financial capacity to do that. And they really embraced that. So the first one was Mildred and Murray Lower Darling Rivers Indigenous Nations. And then that wasn't enough for them. They wanted to split the northern basin up from the southern basin because they felt they had different concerns. And then there was the northern basin, and that's Aboriginal nations, NBAN. And so it's totally funded. These people are funded for every minute of their time, that they're sitting on committees, and there's a small group that, did you run into them at all?
No.
Yeah, that is the administration group, and they're funded as full-time employees. So this is a real recognition that there are voices that need to come to the table, both to bring in traditional knowledge, but also to have a voice in the decisions that are going to affect them and their livelihood. One of the biggest problems with collaboration that we ran into time and time again by trying to sell these new policies is that you're going to consult with people and have these collaborative processes. You've got to listen. It can't just be tell me what you want, oh that was very nice, goodbye. I mean, there's so much of collaboration can go in that direction where you have no intention of doing what they want as policymakers, and people get cranky, and they've actually given their time. And sometimes you get people who have got less valuable time out there, and the people who you really need there, that you should be paying to be there, can't afford to be there.
I think we have time for maybe one last question.
I'm just thinking, again, the whole discussion around timing and collaboration, thinking about source water protection as an example, and how some of the source protection things are starting to look at quantity now in their little policies. One of those maybe coming back to MOECC and say, one of our policies is for the source protection area, we will develop priorities. So how do you juggle that need to satisfy the requirement of policy for that piece of geography versus the whole provincial responsibility? And how do you build collaboration in that whole timeline and response?
That's a good question. Yeah, it's a challenge. I mean, we're dealing with a province-wide framework, so how do we go and make a set of priorities for one particular area? Without thinking about the implications for the rest of the province, to be honest, it's difficult to think about that working within the framework the way it's currently structured, which is why I just wonder about the merits of looking at places like Australia, and there's others even closer, such as Minnesota, British Columbia, that are starting to look at the need about taking an area-based, whether it's a watershed or a groundwater area-based approach to setting rules or setting priorities based on areas where there's a particular stress happening. So I think that would be difficult to implement the way that the framework is now, but I think the timing is right, that we're thinking about those questions as part of this larger review that we're doing. The only other thing I'd say is that I guess in Ontario, I've talked with people about the issue of prioritizing water use, and I've sort of heard different perspectives about, on the one side, don't you dare, province, tell us what the priorities are in our area, let us do that. Whereas I've also heard, don't leave it to us to figure out, because we'll, again, I've seen it on the ground in some of those meetings I sat in Australia, where once it gets to the point where there's not enough water and you're looking around the table at different sectors and, people growing different crops even within the agricultural sector, it's a difficult discussion to have and a difficult challenge to resolve. So, I'm not sure which way is right to go, just to point out that I've sort of heard different perspectives within Ontario about how we should approach that issue about deciding who gets what when water's scarce.
Well, I think maybe we'll wrap it up there. Thank you very much to all three of you. I really appreciated hearing your perspectives and getting to have that dialogue between